talk without referring with the title that Mindy has, so you'll notice that I renamed the talk. So it can either be the talk that's on the handout there, or the first part, or the second part, or any blend of all three, whatever you want. Before I get started, so that I'm not preaching to the choir or against the choir, I'd like to kind of get a picture of who's from what background, so I have some ideas of what kinds of things to emphasize in the talk I'm giving. Mindy mentioned talks that will be next semester. I think one of the talks that's scheduled fairly early on in this semester is a more technical version of a power analysis talk that Julia Silva and I will be giving. So this is kind of the non-technical introduction to the next session that we're going to have. But how many people in here are faculty? Okay, so we got about 3 faculty. The rest of you are graduate students. How many in statistics? Oh, I know nobody's in statistics here. How many? Can you give me an idea of what kind of majors or disciplinary areas? Excuse me? QQPM. QQPM. Okay.
Actually, computer science.
Computer science. A little different. Okay. All right. Okay, so we've got a mix of computer science, quantitative methods. So some of this, parts of this talk will be directed to various people in various ways, but what I'm going to be talking about is alternatively how I've been consulting now for, I think I did my first consulting as a graduate student at the University of Kentucky in 1976. I had been there for about a year, and I got tired of book learning and decided that I wanted to see how things actually worked. The first thing that you experience when you go from the classroom to an actual consulting situation is that all of the seemingly easy problems that you had the first week of your first stat course suddenly become incredibly difficult when a researcher is presenting them to you. So I've been consulting for now about 31 years, which sometimes I pinch myself. And so some of what I'm going to be talking about is just what I've observed about the process of the dialogue that goes on between statistician and subject matter researcher. If your career is pointing you toward a position where you are going to be the statistical expert, and a lot of people in quantitative QQME program will probably be pointing in that direction, then some of this talk is directed to you. If you're going to be primarily in the position of being a consumer of statistical methods, and there are other parts of this that are directed to you. And a lot of it, I hope, is directed to both groups, possibly in various ways. So when we're first considering any kind of a research project, it seems like we're kind of sometimes in a deep, deep woods, and you can kind of see the objective way, way up there, but you know, you sometimes feel like you're on one level and the statistician is sort of up on another level, and are you ever going to be able to develop an effective way of communicating? And so what I hope is by the time we're done, at least we have a better sense of how this works. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about first is what I see the role of a statistician in the research process. And then I'll kind of take you through a process that I've, through various mentors, kind of worked out as being a way of thinking through from when a research project is first being planned to finished product, whether that's the final submission of a grant proposal or finally getting that journal article into print or successfully defending your dissertation, whatever. Then when we get through this process thing, then there are a lot of things that have to happen in order for there to be an effective partnership. And what I'd like to suggest is that the most effective way that statistics and subject matter disciplines work together is thinking in terms of scientific teams. You know, we hear at grant writing workshops anymore that very little research that's really meaningful anymore is a single author kind of, or even a single discipline kind of enterprise, and that we more and more need to think in terms of multidisciplinary activities and partnerships. And that's certainly true. I usually tell our statistics graduate students that if it were just the mathematical statistics, I have a hard time seeing that our discipline, you know, well, I certainly did not go into statistics for its own sake. I actually was a psychology major who decided in my last semester of my senior year that was not what I wanted to do for a living, at least not exclusively. I had been pretty good in math all the way along, and had long since decided that math was not what I wanted to do for a living. And I finally, fortunately, had a conversation with the chair of the statistics department at the University of Kentucky, and I realized I could be good in math but not have to do it for its own sake. And because statistics interacts with a lot of other disciplines, I could actually get paid and never have to decide what I wanted to do when I grew up. And it seemed like a really good deal, so that's the direction I went. Okay, and then finally we're going to talk a little bit about some things that I see going wrong in the relationship between our discipline and others, and what we might be able to do about that. Okay, so let's start with a series of kind of stage-setting quotes. This is something I heard on NPR while I was driving somewhere. I didn't catch who said it, but he basically it was actually a statistician being interviewed. And what he said, that we all know that there are various kinds of storytellers in the arts. Writers tell stories with words, painters tell stories with pictures, musicians do it with their music. Statisticians are actually storytellers, but the story is being told through numbers. And the thing that I often tell our graduate students, however, is, but you gotta have a story to tell. If all you have is really, really snazzy methodology and a cool computer, but you don't really get into understanding the science that you're working with when you're working with a consultee, then all those methods don't really mean a whole lot. And so the object here is that what I tell the statisticians then is that the object of consulting, and then I quickly change my mind and say, no, I really don't want that word. The object of the collaboration is the science and not the math and not the statistical technique. So at the end of the day, we've got a problem. It's not a statistical problem, although it may generate statistical problems. But at the end of the day, it's something else. Okay, another cool quote that I heard, I think my uncle's a lawyer, and we exchange lawyer and statistician jokes. My dad's actually an economist, so you get the three of us together, and everybody's discipline is pretty bad. But there are three subjects everybody thinks they can be an expert in with no formal training at all. Two of them we know are law and medicine. You know, you can always figure out how to get through some legal process without ever talking to a lawyer until you get in trouble. And everybody, of course, knows what's good for them, much more so than their doctor. And statistics is the other area. Okay. And obviously, none of those are true. Okay. So, somebody once said that early on, how to think about statistics, as you can think about it in the context that we're talking about today, is sort of the rules of evidence in a scientific inquiry. And I'll often use a legal analogy when I'm teaching my statistical methods classes, that in some way the whole process of hypothesis testing is a lot like a courtroom trial. You know, with the hypothesis serving the role of accusing, well, it's actually the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. The alternate hypothesis is kind of like why you arrested the person in the first place. Then you have the evidence, those are the numbers. Then you do the t-test, that's sort of like what you give to the jury to make a decision, and so forth and so on. Webster has this absolutely awful definition of statistics, which I think has been probably for 2 generations a real problem for our profession and its image. And so my son was messing around with a camera and I got tired of it, and so I think this is kind of an appropriate reaction to that definition. A better definition is that statistics is a science of data collection, analysis, and reporting. And at the end of the day, the object is you want to characterize a population, or you want to make a decision of some type. And so that's the whole idea here. And if you go to the American Statistical Association website, they're even now they're even describing the profession as statistical science, and trying to get away from the idea of mathematics. And so one of the things that I often tell introductory classes is that you can think of statistics as kind of like more analogously to physics than mathematics. And that is, you couldn't do physics without the mathematical tools, but at the end of the day, you're not doing physics, or you're not doing mathematics, but you're doing something with it. Okay, so some of the influences that I have when I approach these kind of problems, my major professor, R.L. Anderson, was kind of my first consulting mentor, and the thing that rings in my ears to this very day is every time we would have a new consulting problem. He was a gruff old guy. He had a heart of gold, but he would scare you to death when you first met him. And every time somebody come in, he'd walk away, the client would walk away, and he'd look at this and he'd say, "This is the worst data set I ever saw. I can't believe people would do stuff like this. What were they thinking?" And then he would calm down and he would walk us through the whole process, and I just learned an immense amount from him. Gerald Hahn, unfortunately I wasn't able to get a picture of him. He's probably one of the more influential industry statisticians. And he wrote a really good article in which he made the point that about 90% of the value of statistics is what happens before the data are ever collected. It's an interesting cognitive dissonance, because if you look at the curriculum of the courses in our department, 90% of the classes are about data analysis, which means that most of the methodology in our discipline has been motivated by the 10% of where the 90% of cases where people didn't think about their design until they were at the oh my god stage of I've got this data now, what do I do with it? And you get Dr. Anderson's reaction, and then you have to invent methodology that's basically data repair. Okay? And his point was that if people would talk to me first, the analysis is actually the easy part. It's thinking about what you're doing at the beginning that's the hard part of statistics, and probably where the main contribution is going. And then finally, Walt Federer. I didn't meet him until I had already started at the University of Nebraska, but he was a major influence in applied statistics. He worked at Cornell University. I was talking to somebody, he's 91 years old, and he still goes to the office every day. He still is sort of an ad hoc member of a number of PhD committees, and still is challenging the faculty at Cornell to this day. But one of the things he said that really sticks with me is that this process of statistical consulting is really more like research consulting. If you do this really well, what we will have is a dialogue about what you're trying to learn in your research project. And if you're doing statistical consulting, what you need to do is get whoever you're talking to into a dialogue where they're teaching you as much about what they're trying to find out as you're teaching them about the statistics. And if you can work it that way, then what you really wind up doing is helping not just the statistical part, the narrow little part, but the whole research process. E.O. Wilson, I think, has a book right now, major influence in the biological sciences, but a major thinker in the philosophy of science. And I don't have the exact quote, but it was something to the effect that when people are doing really good science, the hallmark of it is their ability to phrase the question properly in the first place. What they do afterwards, if you don't have the right question, then no matter what you do afterwards, it's not going to be very good. If you got the right question, then what you do afterwards can actually be sort of mediocre, but it's still neat stuff because you've asked an important question. And what I would add to this is just that you've got to collect the data properly as well. So where's this all leading? Well, the basic theme here is planning is probably the most important statistical activity there is, in spite of what's on our curriculum, and in spite of what people think about our discipline. So, little hopefully we're not at this point right here when we're walking through this. So this is what I want to do for the rest of the time now is to kind of orient this talk around, this is sort of a statistician's view of the scientific method and what I try to work through with people when we're involved in a collaboration. And it really begins, of course, with, it probably begins with actually the last research project, which, if it was any good, generated as many questions as it answered. And so now we have a research question, and it's probably framed in the researcher's mind very much in the jargon and the language of their discipline. So the first thing we have to do is translate that into what my wife calls stat speak, which is basically anytime I'm talking to her and using all this jargon from work that isn't necessarily very communicative. But eventually we get to the point where we've got this research question rephrased in a way that we can now begin to think about how would we know if we had an answer? What's the relevant evidence here? How do we inform this question? And so this gives an idea of what response variables we ought to be looking at. And that in turn leads us to the questions about how would we use this evidence to answer the question. Would we do a t-test? Would we do a multivariate analysis? What kinds of statistical techniques? Has anybody ever worked with data of this kind before? Do we actually, as a precondition to even working with these data, develop a new statistical methodology to handle it? Probably the place where this all hangs or falls is how are we going to collect the data? Does it call for an experimental design or a quasi-design? Does it call for a sample survey? Are we going to be able to do this? What kind of compromises? What would be the ideal way to do it? And what's the practicable way we could actually do it? And how much compromise does that entail? And what does that tell us about how we're going to analyze the data? How much evidence do we need? So we have to do sample size analyses. And I worked for years in agriculture, and this answer was always 4, which would be laughable in a social science setting. But it's actually laughable in a lot of biological science settings as well. Then we need to collect the data, do the analysis, reach conclusions. When we have an answer, there's actually a lot of stuff that happens here too, because oftentimes with statistical methodology evolving as quickly as it is, because of the evolution of computers, basically, there's methodology that was developed in theory in 1980, and everybody said, well, that's really neat theory, but nobody in life could actually do that, because it would require simulations that would take years to perform. Those analyses, those simulations that would have taken years to perform in 1982 can be done in about 15 minutes on the laptop that's showing this presentation right now. So suddenly there's a lot of stuff that's practical, and now what we're learning is how do these methods actually work with the size of data sets that we're able to collect. Not as n goes to infinity, but when n is 18. How does it work? And the thing that's generating then is that we're suggesting, or we're using statistical methods now that the reviewers of our research and the journal editors have never heard of. So then we get stuff kicked back saying, we don't understand what we did, we'd like you to do it like this article was done. And then I have to write them a letter and explain, well, when this article was done, that was the best we knew how to do. We now know that that's actually a really, really poor technique. This is a lot better, and here's why. And so we go through this kind of negotiation. So this is kind of the series of things that have been evolving, that are involved in the consulting. One of the problems that we struggle with is that often the statistician doesn't jump into this wheel until about right here. And it's so much better if we're involved back here. And that almost cannot be overemphasized. So when's the planning applicable? Well, when Dr. Hoyt was here, we've been talking a lot about grant writing and the parts, describing the problem, describing what will be measured, describing the statistical design and analysis that we're planning, including a power analysis. And grant writing is really important. But there's some other things where what we're talking about today are equally applicable. And I kind of want to stress that the core facility is not just for grant writing, but it's also for things like getting your dissertation done and working with us during that process. Once you have the grant and you're doing the research, you're going to want to get stuff published. That's deeply involved in what we're talking about today. And the other thing is, since we are a public institution, a lot of what we do, if we're doing it right, should be informing public policy. About 10 years ago, the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who's the only senator in my lifetime, I think, who actually had a PhD and had done social science research. And I think he actually had a stat minor, which was really cool. He came to the ASA about 10 years ago and gave the keynote address. And one of the things that he said that really stuck with me was words to the effect of that in this nation we face a choice, and that is we can continue to do what we've been doing for the last 10 or 15 years, and that's have Republicans and Democrats, conservatives and liberals screaming at each other and making policy basically on the basis of what he called data-free ideology. Or we can let the centrists regain control in the country and begin informing policy with, by actually listening to what our better universities are finding out, and maybe there's a way to rationally decide, is this going to work or not? And as a public research university, one of the reasons that we were founded in the first place, even though a lot of the public doesn't remember it, sometimes we have to remind ourselves too, is that part of the reason that state's making an investment in our existence is to help inform public policy, make good decisions about how we deal with, how we plan for the future and deal with the problems that we have. Okay, one of the things that we're going to put on the web, another of my committee members, a guy named Walt Kratzer, he liked to define statistics as experimentation science, and he later left the university and went to pharmaceutical industry, and he designed something called a protocol description form. And although this was intended for pharmaceutical research, if you look through it, it gives a nice template for the kind of process that one ought to work through when you're writing a grant, when you're planning your dissertation research, when you're beginning to do any kind of a research project. I pulled this from memory. I'm going to get the exact copy of it and we'll put it on the website. But it's basically a table where you work through this kind of wheel that I gave a little bit earlier and talk about what you're planning to do for the research. And in the pharmaceutical industry, in order to pass some of the regulatory requirements, what you actually have to do when you're going through the stages of developing a new drug is present this to the FDA, and the research and development of a pharmaceutical company and the FDA regulators have to be on the same page about whether this is acceptable or not. They're very similar kinds of templates that medical researchers have to go through when they're doing clinical trials to certify or at least validate proposed new therapies that they're going to use. But the steps, I think, are transferable to just about any research in any discipline if you just tweak with the words a little bit. But they start basically with what are the objectives. And we all have objectives, but the key thing is that all of these objectives have to have meaningful operating definitions so you know exactly what you're doing. I'll give you an example of that a little bit later, but sometimes we think we're being clear about what we're trying to accomplish, the research, and then when we actually sit down, it becomes increasingly apparent we're not all that clear. And I know, I've been through this before, but I think each of us is incredibly good at kidding ourselves about whether we have good operating definitions or not. What's the relevant evidence? And what Dow was really big on was distinguishing between the essential variables. In other words, what do you really need to measure to answer this question? As opposed to, oh, while we're at it, we can measure all these 192 variables too. That may be nice to measure, but they might also create an incredible amount of confusion. And so we need to think hard about, what are we going to do with that stuff? Somebody actually suggested that the university could quit collecting data today in any way, shape, or form and still have enough data lying around that haven't been looked at to be able to generate research papers for the next 10 years. And that's probably all these things right here. Okay, what are the measurement units? And so implied in this is defining what the target population is. And often what I see researchers doing is they start to collect data and you start thinking about, well, where would the results of this actually be applicable? And sometimes it's real clear and sometimes it's not well thought out. In designed experiments, there's a distinction between what's called a treatment design and what's called an experiment design. The treatment design is basically what factors are you looking at? What do you want to find out if there's a treatment effect? The experiment design is actually how do you get the treatments to the units that you have. So if I were doing something like trying to find out if a new teaching method would be effective for introductory statistics, my treatment design would be the old method versus the new method. My experiment design would be I randomly select half of you to take my class the old way and half of you to take my class the new way. It'd be a real simple example of this. This first shows up actually when we do two treatment comparisons. And the treatment comparison is the design, and then either the independent or the paired, which leads to the two kinds of t-tests, is actually the first introduction to an experiment design. Both of these have sample survey analogs. So there is, when you do a sample survey, you're probably looking for some kind of an effect. It may be stated or it may not. And the analog to the experiment design is, of course, how you design a survey. Do you do cluster sampling? Do you do stratified random sampling, and so forth? Power analysis, we'll go into a great deal of detail in the next talk that Julia Sulikova and I are doing. One of the things we're doing there is looking at a lot of statistical software that say they do power analyses. Some of them do it pretty well, and some of them advertise really well. I'll leave it at that for now. Part of this planning at this point is to assume that things are going to go wrong and try to anticipate them and have a backup plan. So you need to go into any kind of research project with a plan A, B, and C at least, because things are going to go wrong. And this is also why it's a good idea to have a statistician involved early, because that way you can begin to make those contingency plans, but also you've got enough of a rapport established that when something begins to go wrong, you can give them a call and you don't have to spend 3 days bringing them up to speed. They'll pretty much know what you're doing, so a 10-minute conversation may accomplish a workable fix. Finally, this is all planning, then we finally get to questions of how do we analyze the data. And actually, we'll make this a lot clearer later in this talk and certainly when we do the power analysis. But if you do the power analysis right, what you're actually doing is a dress rehearsal of the data analysis. And you may finish the power analysis with the templates already in place, and all you do is feed the data that you actually collected rather than the kind of simulated data, and rerun the power analysis with your real data, and now your analysis is done. Okay. So We'll put that on the website, and I'll try to add some conversations. When you're working with a statistician, my grandmother used to say, haste makes waste. It's true. Take your time, build a relationship. It's a two-way street. So what I try to work on, what I had to learn when I first started doing this, and what I try to work on with our graduate students, is that when you're first visiting with somebody, they ought to be talking more than you are. You ought to, because when you and I sit down in the room, you don't have a PhD in statistics, and I certainly don't have training in your subject matter area. So if I'm going to be really helpful, I've got to learn what you're doing, and you've got to teach me. And I love to learn about, one of the reasons I went into statistics I mentioned earlier is I love to learn about what other people are doing. I'm a professional dilettante, and I love having, educated layperson knowledge about every discipline I can possibly learn about. And I have to get to that point before I can be an effective consultant. So when I ask you questions, I'm not doing it to set you up to embarrass you. I'm asking you because I'm curious and because I can't help you unless I understand it better. So allow the members of the team to be experts in their area. And to the extent possible, try to avoid speaking in your own discipline speak. Use real English. Okay, so here's what you don't want. You don't want somebody. All right. Types of statistical investigations. We do research for different reasons. Sometimes we're in a completely novel area. We don't have a clue what's going on. And the whole reason we're doing the research is to, find out. It's basically a fishing expedition. We're looking for patterns that might be there, and we really don't know what we're looking for. Latent class, factor analysis, other multivariate methods are very much in this kind of vein. At the end of the day, you don't have a p-value. What you have is a cluster analysis, where you have something that kind of shines a flashlight on patterns previously unknown and suggests the next thing that you might do. There are situations, particularly in survey sampling, where there is no cause and effect. It's almost meaningless to talk about that, at least not yet, but what you're looking for are associations between various things. Is there a tendency for conservatives to feel one way about an issue and liberals to feel another way about an issue? That's not, you'd spend all year arguing about chicken and egg and get nowhere. What you're looking for is, what are the associations that seem to be there? And maybe you can form theory and test that theory later on. This kind of thing is often based on survey or retrospective data. A lot of medical research starts when doctors notice certain anecdotal kinds of things and begin poking around in data that's lying around in various medical records and get to the point where they say, I think something's going on here. Maybe we should design a more formal experiment and test it. Classic example is smoking and health. Got started that way. And the final thing is the treatment or factor effect. The formal experimental design or kind of quasi-design where you try to do the best you can given that you can't really do a formal experimental design. A lot of social sciences now are pushing what's called the clinical trial model. In some cases it's quite realistic, in other cases I think they're it's nice fantasy, but these are I think the various kinds of investigations. And if you talk to some statisticians, you will get the feeling that there's a value judgment that this is the only true thing to do, and all this other stuff is somehow second class. And that's really not true. It's research happens at a lot of different stages. They're all legitimate, but you have to be honest about where you are in your research and not try to, don't pretend you're doing this when you're actually doing this. Okay. So when we go through this process then, probably the hardest part is defining the research question in a way that is conducive to doing the rest of what you have to do. It's easy to be vague. It's easy to be vague when I mentioned this earlier, when you think you aren't. But probably the most critical single feature of what we're trying to do in this process is to come up with meaningful operating definitions. So one example from this is when we get done with this talk, I'm going to be going over to Lincoln Public Schools with Ruth Heaton. Ruth and Jim Lewis are co-PIs in a NSF project called Math in the Middle. Some of you may have heard it. It's a big institute where middle school math teachers are being brought in to improve their knowledge of mathematics and to develop methodologies by which they can take their improved understanding and kind of get 6th to 8th graders involved in this. One of the things we've noticed in the United States is that when you test kids at the end of the 5th grade, they're near the top of the developed world. When you give the same test toward the 8th grade, they're nearly at the bottom of the developed world. Something not good is happening in middle school in American schools, and the whole purpose of Math in the Middle is to try to address this. So obviously, we have a big research component of this, which is, this objective is Math in the Middle effective? Okay, well, what do you mean by effective? How would you know when it's effective or not? So you have to begin to think through, well, are the kids more excited in class? Are the teachers more involved in what they're doing? Does their morale go up? Are the students learning more? How would you know if they're learning more? What do the standardized tests actually test? Is that a good way to measure whether they're learning more? Maybe what is really we should be looking for is 5 years later, are they better college students because they've learned how to think more broadly? Now, this is not a trivial question at all. But you have to think through that, because you have to think about what am I actually going to measure and how am I going to use that to inform this question. Is it effective compared to what? All the teachers are going through professional development activities. So how do you distinguish this one from others? Some of the teachers are naturally talented. They're going to be good no matter what. Others, we've seen naturally untalented teachers before too. So once effective has an operating definition, how would you measure it? Can you measure it? And what you find out as you go through this process is a lot of times you think you have an operating definition, but until you really can answer this question in a way that's satisfactory to everybody, that if you can't say how you would measure something and have some reasonable assurance that it's actually measuring what you want it to measure, you don't yet have a good operating definition. And I do see a lot of research, no one in here is guilty of course, but I see a lot of research where people are measuring things because that's what people do. My wife is in horticulture, and they had a big research project where they were trying different nutritional regimes, plant nutrition regimes on poinsettias. And what they would do then is they would take the leaves and they would grind them up and they would measure all these elements. And I asked, really stupidly one day, I asked her and her graduate student, what's the bottom line of this? How do you know when this nutritional regime has really succeeded? And the answer was when we have the kind of flowers that people want to buy around Christmas time, kind of plants, poinsettia plants that people want to buy around Christmas time. Well, what does all the chemistry in the leaf tell you about this? Well, if all these things are in the right balance, the plant should look okay. Well, does it look okay? Well, we don't really know. And so what we did was, kind of changed the character of the research project to be more of one where we looked at the relationship. We had a bunch of growers come in from all over eastern Nebraska, and they would rate these plants, and then we would look at how did the way they perceive these plants aesthetically relate to the kind of chemical measurements that we were doing on the leaves. It was a really neat thing, and what they learned was some of the variables that were measured were really important and were actually really good predictors of the way the plant was going to look, and others, they were completely wasting their time, and actually saved the department a whole lot of money, because it, suddenly MDS Pharma didn't have to analyze for these 26 variables because they don't tell you anything anyway. Okay, so moving on, once you've made these decisions, we need to do a power analysis. And like I said, Julie and I are going to be talking about this more technically, but from a point of view of what you need to think about when you first see a statistician, the first kinds of things you need to think about are just what's the target population and what elements would represent that population. And how can you observe the elements? And I put the word ethically in. In biological research, this isn't as big of a problem, although with the ethical treatment of animals, it's getting more important in animal science research. There's not yet an ethical treatment of plants group, although never say never. But in human subjects, obviously this is crucial. The really stupid example I give my introductory classes is the experimental design approach to seeing if smoking is bad for you or not, and that is you assign this group of 13-year-olds to have at it, and there actually are people who are either in jail or should be in jail for doing exactly that kind of research. Okay, but the important thing then is when you begin to sit down with a statistician and go through a power analysis, there's some information that you're going to have or figure out how you can get. And that is when you think about how you're going to represent this population, there will be one or more sources of variation, opportunities for uncertainty to occur. If we're doing a class like when Ruth and I talked to Lincoln Public Schools, we have variability due to different teachers, even if they have the same subject matter material. We have variability between the schools. We have variability among the students within classrooms. We probably have variability due to time of day. Maybe students are more effective in a 9 a.m. class than a 2 p.m. class. And so we need to think about not only what are those sources of variation, but how big is the variability. And we need to think about how big of a treatment effect is considered important. And a lot of this stuff we might be able to get a handle from previous literature. No research exists in a vacuum, so there's probably a precedent for a lot of stuff we're doing. A lot of it we just have to guess. So a lot of times when I'm doing this question right here, I will ask clients, what's the lowest observation you can imagine ever getting on this scale right here, like if it was an achievement test? Well, so they'll say, well, I can't imagine a student getting through the 6th grade without being at least able to score, a 12 on this exam. What's the highest you can imagine ever seeing? Well, we got some pretty good students in the class, so, we do see some hundreds. Okay, so that gives you a range. And then if the data are at least plausibly bell-shaped curve distributed, then you kind of say, well, if the range is this, then, divide that by 6, and you've got a sort of not better than nothing approximation of what the standard deviation is, and then you can move off. What I really try to emphasize with the treatment effect is not what kind of things people have seen before, but when would it matter? Like, even if we could measure a 1-point change on this achievement test, does that have any practical significance at all? What's the smallest change that really means something? And think of the conversation that way. The thing that power analysis shouldn't be is a big black box. If you're starting to get into this and it's becoming a sort of a computer/mathematical exercise in voodoo, then you're not on the right track at all. What you should be having is a dialogue, and this should be where the real mutual learning between statistician and subject matter person is happening. And like I mentioned before, it ought to be a dress rehearsal for the data collection. And I actually prefer, when Julie and I talk about this, I actually prefer staying away from some of the canned software and doing power analysis a little bit more so that it resembles how you're actually going to analyze the data when you get it. Because I think, as a statistician, I learn more about what we're going to have to do with the data once we actually have it. And I see that clients generally get much more insight into what they're doing and maybe even the kinds of things they need to think about during data collection when you're doing this. So we'll talk more about that after Christmas. As I mentioned before, missing data happen. And actually, that's not true. Missing data are inevitable. So you need to think about, the plan for data analysis needs to be, think about whether data are going to be missing at random, whether there's going to be informative missing data. One of the real active areas of research in statistics right now are models to handle informative missing data. In other words, you're doing a sample survey and you get 30% response. The other 70, you just didn't accidentally miss them. 30% are people like me who hear the word survey or see the word out of area on my caller ID and don't answer the phone, and while they're not answering the phone are thinking of awful things to do to the person who's making that awful noise in my house when I'm trying to watch the ball game or have a decent conversation with my son. So people, in medical research, people don't just fail to show up in a clinical trial. They don't come back because there's something wrong with the treatment. It's unpleasant and they don't want to come back. And I've even ran into this working with the veterinary scientists. They decided that a certain treatment was mean to their kitty cats, and they weren't going to take and subject their cat to this kind of treatment anymore. And that was actually the most informative thing about the treatment. It may have been medically effective, but the cats hated it, and the owners didn't want to see their cats suffer that way. Okay, so that can be, so some of the missing data can actually be factored in as if these people don't show up, it's going to tell us something about what's going on. Okay, stay away from jargon and discipline speak. That's a two-way street. It applies to the statistician and to the client. I see a lot of people who are afraid to ask me questions because they don't want me to think they're ignorant. And the answer to that is, if I say something you don't understand, it's my failure, my language skills need work. If I'm not making this clear, ask me a question and make me explain it again using better English. Because even really difficult stat concepts can be made intelligible if somebody uses a little bit of language skill to work through it and draws the right pictures. The other thing is answer the questions. I have a lot of people who just clam up. In fact, they won't even come to make an appointment, but they do everything sort of at a distance through email. Like, I don't want to see the statistician because they'll learn how ignorant I am. And when we ask questions, it's not a hidden agenda to humiliate you. It's really because you can't do good statistical consulting unless you get outside of the stat box and get into the mindset of the discipline that you're working with. And so, and I'm not trained in these areas, so you need to ask. Okay, face-to-face meetings are better. The worst statistical consulting is, I got a grant, it's due tomorrow, can we get a power analysis done this afternoon? Yeah, we can, and it won't be very good. The other thing that I used to run into is the animal science and agronomy students. I've got to leave tomorrow to give my poster session at the meetings, and I haven't done my stat yet. Can we move something out so I can get the poster ready for tomorrow? Well, okay. And then one of my colleagues used to have a sign on his door, which was wonderful, which was, we don't have time to do it right. Well, we got lots of time to do it over. Many times doing it over as you want to be. So the whole thing, I think, is at the bottom of this is having too much ego to, I see a lot of, I have seen colleagues of mine feel like their job is to be the gatekeeper of the academic world, and people come in and their job is to humiliate people, you know, actually taking seriously the kinds of stuff that Dr. Anderson used to say, and saying to the client's face, why did you do this? Why didn't you talk to me earlier? I can't help you now. And of course, I see a lot of subject matter researchers who won't see a statistician because their ego is too inflated to admit that they're not an expert at everything. Kind of goes back to the lawyers, doctors, and statisticians comment that I made earlier. I think Sue Sheridan mentioned this in the last talk that we had too, is that egos in research are not good for one another. When you do the analysis part, it's a lot easier to do a well-designed study. It's a lot easier if the statistician's been involved all along. Just because an analysis is really cool doesn't mean it's good. And just because it's the latest thing. So I've got this principle of parsimony, which is that if you can show something with the simplest conceivable analysis and it's getting the science right, it's okay to use that analysis. It may not be the latest thing. You may actually have to work this through with reviewers who have a different opinion, but stick to your guns. I had a colleague who talked about the 90% rule in statistics, and this kind of has to do with the kind of curriculum that you see in our department. And that is relatively, if you have a well-designed study, relatively simple statistics can answer what's going on. Statisticians spend, particularly mathematical statisticians, spend an awful lot of time with that last 10%. And granted, there's a lot of academic work to be there, but sometimes it would be better to take a lot of that effort and answer genuinely new problems rather than trying to figure out how to eke the last 0.00003% out of a t-test when the original one works awfully well for what it was intended for. Okay, so this is, but at the same time, what I mentioned a little bit earlier is also true, that the computer has made a huge impact on the way we do statistics. And just because things have precedence in the literature doesn't mean that's still the way we're supposed to do them now, because we have methodology that allows us to do a far better job answering questions. One place where I really see this is that it has become very easy to do nonlinear regression now. There was a period in the 1890s when people were looking at lots of dose-response kinds of problems and developing nonlinear models. And then least squares comes along, and it suddenly becomes very easy to do linear and quadratic and cubic regression with a hand calculator. And the hand calculators get better and better and better. And so suddenly, there's about a 50-year gap where people completely forgot that nonlinear regression existed. Except, oh yeah, I read about that once. That looks way too hard. I'm not going to do that. And then about the 1980s come along, and suddenly the software is getting better, and the computers are getting better, and suddenly, you know what? When the curve looks like this, maybe it's cyclic variation, and it's not a ninth-order polynomial. So thinking the problem through and then trying to associate the right method for the problem is really important. As professional statisticians, it's our job to stay current on that. As subject matter researchers' job is to maintain contact with a statistician who's well informed about their subject matter so they can be kept up to date about what's going on at the ASA meetings. The last couple of points, part of the if you've involved a statistician all along, part of the statistician's job is to be a member of the team, which means a lot of the writing is up to, this is my area. I'm supposed to write this stuff if I've been working with you. This is not your job. Well, maybe it is if it's your dissertation. But if it's a journal article or a grant, this is what I'm supposed to write here. And if you've got people involved, then everybody's got to do their part. The other thing to remember is that statistical science itself is a work in progress. So all the statistics in the world wasn't laid down in the 1930s, and it hasn't changed since then. When we do a project, we may notice that there's some pretty good ways to do things, but they're not entirely satisfactory. And now that we have these computers, we can do a lot better. The methods may be unfamiliar to reviewers, so there may be a negotiation process. The last thing I want to talk about, and we've got a couple of minutes left, is just something about etiquette and ethics here. You need to ask yourself, would this research have been possible without the statistician's contribution to this? If the answer is no, you owe somebody a co-authorship. Okay. So a lot of, and I don't think this is as true now, but there have been periods where statisticians who trained me said that there were periods in the kind of history of the discipline where statisticians were kind of treated like mathematically literate gophers, and there was do all this analysis and then thank you very much. That thing I think has been effectively addressed. What's the kind of new area that we're into right now is the area of funding. As the universities, as states increasingly take less responsibility for their public universities, and I think there's no other way to put it than that, external funding has become much more of an important component. If you look at the funding of any state university over the last the last generation or so, you'll see that the percent of public funding in the university since the era of Sputnik, when the government just threw money at universities to catch up with the Russians. Since then, it's gone steadily downhill, and external funding has become much more important. In the old days, what the research offices would do when they were flush with Sputnik money is they would just give the stat department, basically a blank check, and whatever you need to do the consulting for the rest of the university will do, and we're not going to charge anybody else for it. Those days are long, long, long gone. And so the statistician's dilemma is usually, I've got a choice in how I spend my time. I've got to raise money somehow to keep my own professional development, to pay my graduate students and so forth, so I can do my job. And I've got publisher Paris requirements like everybody else does. Now, fortunately, I have enlightened deans who are happy if I'm getting co-authorships by being part of interdisciplinary teams. But if I'm going to do that, I still got to get to professional meetings, and I've still got to employ graduate students. So how do I do that? Well, I can lock my door and write my own grants. And there's plenty of grants that statisticians are getting involved in. But Prim Paul says I really should be participating in interdisciplinary teams. So if I'm going to do that, it's got to be paid for. So the only way this works is if they're co-PI grant arrangements. Not just I'll mention you and give you an acknowledgement, but I got to give you some money so you can do the things you need to do also. So this is, I think, where the cultural issues are right now. This was maybe last generation, and this is the struggle that's going on right now. And I think that'll be, the core facility was basically founded as a way to kind of stimulate that, but as we move through this is going to be increasingly stuff that we have to think about here. The last thing I want to talk about, and then I'll let you go because I know we're a little bit over time, is a special note on graduate students. And this is a message, to me, this is a message. If you're on the faculty and you have graduate students, and if you are a graduate student, what we do not want to happen is what I call graduate student ping pong. And that is a step. The graduate student comes into me and says, I need help designing this experiment and analyzing these data. And I get a description of what it is, and we come up with a plan, and I get a call 3 days later saying, I ran this by my advisor and she hates it. And then we get the graduate, but my advisor doesn't want to meet with you, because we've got this ego thing going on too. So now we've got hands off here and hands off here, and the graduate student stuck in the middle. Not acceptable. So when it's really important when a statistician advises graduate student, and I said on the design and/or analysis, but ideally after all we've talked about, it should be both. Student, major professor, and statistician should be on the same page. Unfortunately, it's probably up to the graduate student to make that happen, to say, we need a three-way meeting so we can have this out. The ideal way to do this actually is to, you need an outside member on your committee. Invite somebody from the staff, if statistics, design and analysis is going to be a major component of the dissertation, you might as well have somebody from the staff department on the committee in the first place. But at least make a plan, make the statistician an adjunct member of the PhD committee and meet with them periodically so that everybody knows what's going on and nobody goes down the wrong path. Okay, so that's, yeah, okay. Wah. We have conflicting demands, blah, blah, blah. The only thing that's really important on this thing is here. Don't feel bad about nagging the statistician. If I said I'd have to do something by Tuesday and it's Thursday and it's not there yet, I probably spaced it off or got involved in something else or got sidetracked, so, remind me. I don't mind. Okay, so I've kind of done the thing of talking so long there's no time for questions, but are there questions? This is a dog in Germany, by the way. Gauss is the criminal mind, not criminal, the mathematical mind responsible for the normal distribution.
The Gaussian distribution?
Yeah, the Gaussian, right, the Gaussian distribution, exactly.
Yeah. Will the PowerPoint be posted on the website?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. I didn't want to let Mindy do it until I went through the talk and make sure there weren't any egregious typos.
Yeah, both the PowerPoint and then also this is videotaped, and so the actual videotape presentation will be available on the web also.
We got through this without a single formula or a single actual technical thought. I don't know if that's what you were looking for, but...
All right, well, thank you all for coming, I appreciate it. And I did want to mention, I know Walt mentioned in his presentation that he and Julia Sulikova are going to be doing another presentation on power analysis. That is February 9th, if you're interested in attending that. Otherwise, if you have any questions, both Walt and I will be around for a little bit if you have any questions. So, thank you.
Yeah, I do have to leave about 1:20 in order to get over to Lincoln Public Schools.